are they producing the results we want? But also from an efficiency standpoint, are they achieving those kinds of results at least cost? And perhaps you might also want to ask, who's benefiting and who's paying those kinds of costs? So there are different ways to evaluate a management plan. I want to emphasize that spatial management is about managing space, human activities in time and space. I just want to give you a few examples of what that means. There are different kinds of management measures, some of which may or may not be in a management plan. There are ways of regulating gear, for example, if you're talking about fisheries. That's not a spatial management activity unless you're specifying it in a particular place. There are process measures, there are output measures that you can implement. But most importantly, again, for spatial management, there are spatial and temporal management measures, these things down in the lower right-hand box. And this is just an example, a list of management measures that would be included in a spatial management plan. There are things like zones, or specifying areas, that would be allocated to specific activities. You could identify an area that says this is where the wind farms are going to be located, or areas where wind farms should be located. You can do it by objective, as John said they have done in the Great Barrier Reef. Identifying areas for development, identifying areas for preservation, etc. But there are lots of other ways you can do it as well, and this, again, I won't go into that kind of detail. I'll give you a simple example of a spatial management measure that is not necessarily an integrated comprehensive plan, but a very simple idea of how ecological, economic, and social objectives were balanced in one particular place, and this happens to be a protected area in the United States, Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary. And there was a problem, and it was a rather simple spatial and temporal problem. There's a traffic separation scheme that goes into Boston Harbor. And this traffic separation scheme is the sort of angled solid line that you see on this particular image. The only problem was it was running right through major concentrations of whales, particularly right whales, at particular times of the year. And the biologists and the scientists could tell us where those whales were likely to be found and when they were going to be there. And the Coast Guard, of course, knew where the transportation scheme was. But there was a conflict, and there were a lot of whale strikes and a lot of whale deaths that occurred because of this existing transportation separation scheme. A very simple analysis said if you simply took this route into Boston Harbor and shifted it a few degrees north, you would minimize the amount of whales that you were steaming through. And in fact, that was done. It took 3 years to get it done. And amazingly, people are behaving in an appropriate way. They're following that transportation. Most ships are following that transportation scheme. And whale strikes have been reduced by something like 80%. So it's a very simple thing. It costs the shipping industry very little money. It costs a little bit of administrative and planning money or resources in terms of shifting that transportation scheme. But the result was a benefit to the environment, particularly to whales, at very little cost to the private sector. I want to also emphasize the importance of having clear objectives in any kind of a planning process. One of the big problems of planning, whether it's land use planning or fisheries management or any kind of planning for management purposes, is very fuzzy objectives. In fact, the objectives are not objectives, they're goals. And there's a difference between goals and objectives. We're talking about very broad statements. Let's preserve the environment, let's protect biodiversity, let's increase employment. Those are goals. But when you want to get down to planning, and in order to carry it out effectively, you have to be able to relate goals, objectives, and management measures in some kind of logic. And you have to be able to specify the objectives in measurable quantitative terms so that you can determine whether or not you're actually getting to where you want to be. This is one example. There's another example just to show that there can be multiple goals, multiple objectives, etc., but there's a relationship among all of these different kinds of terms. Now, I'll finish by a very quick tour around the world to illustrate some of these ideas in terms of where this practice is actually taking place and examples of what I would consider to be good practice. I don't say best practice because we have no idea what best practice is. We're talking about things that appear to be working based on the practice of of marine spatial planning in various places. And again, remember this diagram that I showed, 18 countries, more or less, about 60 to 70 plans being developed of various sizes and shapes. So marine spatial planning can take place at an area as small as Belgium, which is the next to last on this list, I believe. Yes, next to last on the list on the right-hand side. Or it can take place at areas that are truly large areas, as are being carried out in Australia, outside of the Great Barrier Reef. There is life in Australia outside the Great Barrier Reef, and in fact, there's a federal agency that is planning the other parts of Australia in areas that are as large as the Great Barrier Reef. In fact, they're as large as the Mediterranean Sea almost. I said that spatial planning is future-oriented, and again, I'll use the case of the Netherlands to illustrate that point. This is the Netherlands. It's an area, again, probably, I'm not sure how big is the EEZ of Costa Rica, but this is probably a quarter of it, or is it about the same size? 85,000 or something like that in Costa Rica? Yeah. The area of the Dutch EEZ is 57,000 square kilometers. And the important thing here is they've already gone through a spatial plan. In fact, they've gone through 2 rounds of spatial planning, each improving on the previous one. And I like to use this to illustrate the future orientation of the Dutch planning process, because what they have done is they've considered climate change and incorporated climate change in their marine spatial plan. And they've incorporated in a very special way. They've allocated a large part of the Dutch EEZ as a sand extraction area. Why sand extraction? They're going to use that sand to pump it or move it onto the beach to fight the effects of sea level rise, or at least to try to adapt to the effects of sea level rise. Well, ecologists are usually appalled by this idea. You know, how can you possibly go out and allocate that much of the marine environment to sand extraction when we need that area for habitat? It's an important habitat area. We might need it for pipelines to bring oil and gas ashore, etc. And the Dutch premier, or whatever he is, prime minister, said, I know that, but survival is more important to me than this particular space for habitat. It's going to be used to fight climate change. So the result is no infrastructure across this area, no new constraints on the ability for us to go out and grab a lot of sand to put it on our shoreline. There's another part of this that's not future-oriented, but it's an important aspect of marine spatial planning. And I think, again, Steve and John sort of touched on this very lightly. But it's important for the public and for all of us to consider the sea and the space that's contained in our exclusive economic zones as part of the country. To recognize it's part of the country. It's an important space that contains invaluable resources that can be conserved, certainly, and probably will be used, but it has a great value to the nation. And this is represented, I think, very well in terms of what the Dutch have done. The Dutch have a very strong national planning tradition. They produce a water plan, they produce land use plans at the national level on a periodic basis, and they are followed. And the interesting thing that the Dutch have done now is, rather than only consider the terrestrial environment as a planning area or part of the nation, they have, I think, 7 or 8 provinces within the Netherlands. They now have one more province. It's not really a province, but they say our offshore area is as important as any of our provinces with respect to a resource base that can be used or conserved by the nation. So their plan now contains a chapter on the marine environment, just as it does for other parts of the Netherlands. Integration is an important thing, and it's easy to say that planning should be integrated, but it rarely is, particularly in the marine environment. Usually there's 1 or 2 activities that are excluded from any planning requirement, and often it's fisheries, either excluded by choice, of fishermen just simply saying we're not going to participate, or, as in the case of Massachusetts, excluded by state legislation, where the interests of fisheries went to the people who were developing the authorization for marine spatial planning and said, we don't want to be involved in this process. We have enough problems dealing with regulations and that we already have to deal with. So in the case of Massachusetts, fisheries was not involved. In the case of Norway, it's probably the best example in the world of an integrated approach. There are 4 major sectors that are involved in the Norwegian EEZ. The previous slide was just the 3 areas that are